Railroad Accounting Principles, Final Report, September 1st, 1987, Volume 2, Detailed Report. Railroad Accounting Principal Board. The Railroad Accounting Principal Board is Charles E. Bowser, Chairman, Charles E. Bath, Richard E. Briggs, Jack L. Maffei, Merton J. Peck, Gordon Schillinglaw, Ronald Young, and Executive Director Charles E. R. Yeager. Railroad Accounting, September 1st, 1987. The President of the Senate and Speaker of the House of Representatives enclosed a detailed report of the Volume 2 of the Railroad Accounting Principal Board. Both of the sum of the report of Volume 1. The report is issued by the Board to comply with the requirements of the Staggers Rail Act of 1980, the Title U49, U.S. Standard Code 11167, Volume 2. Detailed discussion is how railroad accounting principles apply to the determinations made by the regularity proceeding before the Interstate Commerce Commission in its elaborate of factors considered by the board as reaching its conclusion. All individual members prefer different approaches to certain issues. The board unanimously in decision to publish both volumes of the report. Charles E. Bowser, Chairman. Railroad Accounting Principles Final Report, September 1st, 1987, Volume 2, Detailed Report. Railroad Accounting Principal Board. Volume 2, Abbreviations Introduction. Chapter 1, Part Accounting Principles. Casualty, homogeneity, practicality, data integrity, entity, cost of capital as asset valuation, related expenses, productivity. Chapter 2, Specific Operations, Revenue Adequacy, Maximum Rate, Competitive Access, Abandonment Surcharge, Minimum Rate, Long Canon, Rail Cost, Adjustment Factor. Part 3, General Purpose Costing Systems, Effects of the Railroad Accounting, Rail Form A and Uniform Cost Systems, Regression Analysis, Issues, Information Requirements, and Glossary References and Appendix. Abbreviations: the AAR, Association of American Railroads; AICP, American Institution of Certified Public Accountants; APB, Accounting Principal Board; ARB, Accounting Research Bulletin; BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics; Cost Analysis Organization; CAO, CMP, Constrained Market Pricing; DA, Depreciation Account; DCF, Discounted Cash Flow; DVC, Directly Variable Costs; FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board; GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles; GAS, Generally Accepted Auditing Standards; GPCS, Governing Purpose Cost System; ICA, Interstate Commerce Act; ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission; M&O, Maintenance and Operation; MGMT and /M, Mile Gross Ton, Million Gross Ton Miles per Mile; NLV, Net Liquidation Value; PCF, Presumptive Cost of the Floor; R-1, Railroad Annual Report Form; R1, RAPB, Railroad Accounting Principal Board; RCAF, Railway Cost Adjustment Factor; RF, Rail Form A; ROI, Return on Investment; Retirement, Replacement, Betterment; SAC, SAC, Standalone Costs, SAS; Statements of Auditing Standards, SEC, Securities Exchange Commissions, SRA, Staggers Rail Act of 1980, USAOA, Uniform System of Accountants; URSC, Uniform Rail Costing System; 4R Act, the Railroad Revitalization Regulatory Reform Act of 1976. Introduction. In accordance with the congressional mandate, the Railroad Accounting Principal Board has established 8 railroad accounting principles to govern the determination of the cost of specific regulatory purposes. The Railroad Accounting Principle describes the principles in the application of this document. Volume 1, published separately, identifies the principles, briefly discuss regulatory circumstances in which the principles will apply, outline, and effects of the principles that are intended to have on the existing Interstate Commerce Commission practices. This volume 2, discusses the matter of the in greater deal, explains alternative principles considered by the Railroad Accounting Principal Board during the deliberations and factors contributed to the conclusions reached by the Railroad Accounting Principles. Legislative background: the Railroad Revitalization Regulatory Reform Act Act of 1976 was enacted by the Congress to improve the financial viability of the nation's railroad. The legislation made a number of sweeping changes to the railroad regulatory environment, emphasized the need for the Interstate Commerce Commission to use a more accurate accounting of the cost data in response to the needs of the Interstate Commerce Commission Act, expanded the prescribed regulatory accounting of the Uniform System of Accounts, USOA's 1978, and ICC also began a program to replace the existing rail form ARFA, costing the system for the most sophisticated uniform rail costing system, URSC. RFA and URCS are accounting allocating systems that are statistically techniques to generate variable unit costs and the annual expenses operating information reported to the Interstate Commerce Commission. The RFA originally developed in 1939 using the USOA. Developed in 1907, underlying the statistically studies that were last updated in 1972. The Uniform Railroad Costing System, which has not been approved by the regulatory costing purposes as a result of the revised expanded the USOA. Statistical studies completed in 1982, the URCS is designed to facilitate more frequently updating statistical studies. The Staggered Rail Act of 1980 further reduces the scope of the regulation intended to provide the railroad industry with the additional incentives for ensuring railroad long-term viability, attempting to balance the needs of carriers, shippers, public, and completion that does not exist. Certain important issues dealing with the determination whether the list is unresolved by the SRA, and this issues long faces disagreement between shippers and railroaders. Railroad Accounting Board was created by the SRA in 1980 and was funded in 1984 to establish a body of accounting principles to serve as the framework, implementation, regulatory provisions with the cost determination of the vital role to make an administrative legislative recommendations to deem the means to integrate the principle of the regulatory process. According to the SRA, the ICC implemented and enforced the RAPB through the rulemaking process. That's really interested in the party's opportunity to participate with the Interstate Commerce Commission, ultimately responsible for costs and principles. It must review the principles of the light rulemaking and interested parties responsible explaining the rules as it drops. However, the part of the rulemaking of the ICC must, according to substantial differences of the RAPP, to the principles to the rational underlying of those principles. During the past 2.5 years of the RAP, it considers the various issues proposed by principles relying on the staff researches and consultation. ICC proceeding in the public comment. The RAPD published a notice of February 20th, 1985, Federal Register inviting the public to comment on the issue. The RAPP should be subsequent railroad accounting principle should be board should publish a notice in 1931. January 31st, 1986. The Federal Register inviting the public to comment on the proposed solutions series issues and questions contained in the Railroad Accounting Principle Board. Discussing the memorandum, the Railroad Accounting Principle Board published a notice of the February 20, 1987 Federal Register inviting the public comment in the written form of the proposed principles recommendations contained by the Railroad Accounting Principle Board. Exposure to the draft of the report. The final of the Railroad Accounting Principle Board held a hearing on the proposed principles on April 30, 1987, Washington. At the interested parties appeared on the presented oral statements. Specific regulatory applications. Railroad accounting principle provided by the framework determined the railroad costs. The specific regulatory applications principles are primarily to the Class 1 railroads affiliated with Class 2 and Class 3. Other railroads affiliated is, however, the Interstate Commerce Commission of the Class 2 and Class 3 railroads provided the cost information with the Class 1 for the specific regulatory principles. The principle would apply the railroad accounting principles may not provide for every regulatory determination that the ICC addresses. For example, do not address allocations appropriatements of burden and depend on the regulatory policy objectives. The SRA provides the railroad accounting principles in taking into accounting regulatory purposes of the railroad costing required during the RAPB. The RAPB's deliberation and the commentaries argued the authorization legislation did not grant the Railroad Accounting Principle Board jurisdiction to provide the certain principles of applications covered by this report. Railroad Accounting Principle determined the principles of application provided by the herein to follow the scope and the statutory mandate. Supporting opinions of the Council may be found in Volume 2, Appendix 2. Volume 2, Appendix, that specific regulatory applications addressing the Railroad Accounting Principles are described below. Revenue adequacy. The ICC required to determine annually whether the individual railroads generate revenues that are adequate to cover all total operation expenses, the cost of the capital. Railroads revenue adequate are subject to the greater regulatory control than those that are not. Regulatory standard about the ICC measures of revenue in whether the return of the investment equals the cost of the capital and focusing the efforts of the cost elements. Regulatory standards, not regulatory policies, appropriate standards for determining the revenue adequacy. Maximum rate. Railroads may not change the captive shipper rate exceeding the responsible maximum level. One of the factors of the ICC presents considerably determine whether the rate is responsible is relationship cost. Yeah, Interstate Commerce Commission considered a large movement of the coal unreasonable exceeds cost of the hypothetical new completer is to provide the need service and captive shippers other than designated shippers. These costs are refer to the standalone costs ASC. However, the maximum rate responsible for proceeding other than large movements of coal, the ICC accepted the cost evidence based on methodology, proposed regulatory standards, other SAC. The Railroad Accounting Principle Board focused its SAC, the standalone costs, without addressing whether the appropriate regulatory costs for the standards of maximum rate in responsible cases. Competitive access. The ICC establishes responsible rates for one railroad may charge another railroad for providing switching services for using the tracks. Additionally, considering the cost of the railroad providing access, the ICC also considers the factors joint rate route cancellation sometimes within the purview of the competitive access. However, the variable cost is in such case typically developed in the general purpose costing system. The GPCS is subject to the movement of the specific adjustment do not require the separate specific action consideration. Abandonment and surcharge. A railroad may allow to be abandoned a branch line and a surcharge to shipment from another branch line if the railroad is earning a sufficient number revenue of the line. According to the President, the ICC standards, branch line revenue is sufficient as they are equal exceeds the costs could be avoided by the railroad and did not have served the branch line in question, including the opportunity costs associated with the maintaining services, the portion of the railroad non-branch variable costs associated with the shipments operating and the termination of the branch line factors. The minimum rate and long canon factors. ICC prohibits the setting of the rates for reasonable minimum level and with the Interstate Commerce Commission determined to be equal directly variable costs. The Interstate Commerce Commission is required to consider three factors known as the long canon determination of the rate exceeding the responsible maximum level. Traffic which does not contribute to the going concern value. The traffic on the revenues, the increased traffic of the paying unreasonable share of the revenues. Railroad Accounting Principle Board addressed only the ICC minimum rate of reasonableness. The first long-term canon and the terms of determination minimum costs recovered to the contribute to the going of the concern value. These determinations same of the costs that remain of the long canon factors from management, pricing, effective efficiency, cross subsidizing consideration where the role of the cost is not clearly defined by the ICC policy. Consistently, subsequently, the minimum rate long canon factors pertain to only firstly long factors. Railroad cost and adjustment factor. Railroad also permitted to recover inflammatory cost increase with the minimum regulatory involvement of the index tariff rates. They recover such as cost that index of the railroad costing adjustment factor (RCAF). The railroad costing adjustment factor computed using a forecast indexing the industry-wide input prices compromised by the labor, fuel, material, supplies, equipment, depreciation, and other expenses. General purpose of the system. And the ICC uses the general purpose of the regulatory system is to estimate the variable costs and the certain specific regulatory applications. For example, the Interstate Commerce Commission has regulatory jurisdiction only over the traffic tariffs compared with the percentage basis of the certain railroad, verifying the cost of the traffic exceeding the statutory threshold. The statute requires the general purpose costing system to calculate the variable cost. The general purpose costing system may be used to estimate and eliminate the movement and other proceedings involving the maximum rate, competitive access, abandonment, surcharge when detailed approaches are cost effective. When the general purpose costing system reported expenses related to the output of applying the regression question of the railroad funding adjustment in the URCS expenses and aggregate the reconcile reported operation expense. However, the use of the general accepted accounting, the GAAP. However, the cost of the capital amount is computed including using estimated variable. The variable cost it's used to compute the variable cost of output. The variable cost of output is multiplied by the appropriate measures output called service units. The moments involved. Part 1, Railroad Accounting Principles.